Good morning, everyone. We've had just about enough time for the caffeine to infuse into my system, so I do apologise if I talk a bit rapid. I'm Alex. I'm from Alderney. I'm talking to you today as the Alderney Ramsar Secretariat. So that's a role I do for the States of Alderney, administering the Ramsar Site on their behalf. And we're going to talk about some of Alderneys Seabirds, but we're going to start off with a little background on Ramsar in Alderney. So, Ramsar in Alderney, the convention in action. Now, it was established in 2005, and you can see the site outlined in black there. It really is important for Alderney because it covers a lot of our really key seabird species. It's covered by annual review and 5-year strategies, and this is all underpinned by a recovery of cost budget. So the States of Alderney provides a budget which can be used to cover things like equipment costs, etc., but not things like staff time. So it's also, of course, underpinned by a huge number of volunteer hours from the organisations which take part. And oh, there we go. There we go. We got it back. And this little flowchart shows you these organisations and basically how the site works. So the work is delivered by the Alderney Wildlife Trust, the Alderney Animal Welfare Society, the Alderney Bird Observatory, and the Channel Islands Bird Ringing Scheme. They produce some lovely reports each year, which they feed through to me as the Ramsar Secretariat. This is then passed through an advisory group, the Alderney Ramsar Advisory Group, who essentially peer review the work. And then the final decision on whether to approve the next year's work programme is then given to the States of Alderney. So what's this enabled for seabirds? That's the focus of our talk today. Well, it's enabled consistent data collection. It's enabled conservation action, and it's enabled outreach and education. And I've pulled up this sign, which the Harbour Office have recently put up on Purdie, because I think it nicely encapsulates these three things. So this shows the areas which are particularly sensitive for seabirds and grey seals on Purdie, and we only know these areas because of long-term data collection. Of course, then it neatly wraps up conservation action and outreach into one, because it gives the public a really clear guidance on how they can avoid harming this wildlife. And one thing I really like is it also has a little thing there where you can submit your wildlife sightings at the bottom of the QR code, which is quite nice. So that's the background on Ramsar, a very quick one. If you want to talk more about it, please do come chat to me later. But we're going to move now on to some of Alderneys seabirds. Now, there's quite a few species breeding around the island, but we're going to focus on two today. And that's two that I have carefully excluded from this little slide here. And the first one is the Atlantic puffin. So Alderney once had quite a significant population of Atlantic puffin, possibly as much as 100,000. Some estimates around 50,000, but nevertheless, there were thousands and thousands of these seabirds here. But there were severe declines in the 20th century, largely due to things like disease, oil spills, competition with fisheries, and disturbance. The first real protections for these seabirds came in the 1980s. That was largely in the form of protection from disturbance with people like the Purdie Warden. And now there is regular monitoring and conservation action under the Ramsar programme. And what we're going to talk about now is monitoring them. So the problem with Purdie is the puffins, they're very sensitive to disturbance. So what we do is we use a spy camera. And this is what that footage is from today. So we can see a little Atlantic puffin wandering around on Purdie. So what we do is we follow the seabird monitoring programme methodology. Essentially, you're looking at active burrows in the early season and then looking at those ones which have fish returns to them later in the season. We can also collect information on kleptoparasitism, so when things like gulls are stealing fish from the puffins, and predation. So there's a few benefits to this. There's no disturbance during the season. That puffin has no idea we're watching at the moment. Also, all data is future-proof, and I think that's really important. So all the data is recorded and saved. That means that if someone wants to go back and look at something else, like provisioning, they can do that in the future. But it's labour-intensive. It takes thousands of hours to review this footage, and it's very exposed to the weather. So there are some disadvantages. Okay, so that's productivity, but what do we do about the puffin population? So we have a couple of different survey methods, and the first one is raft counts. So what we do, because we don't want to go on the island during the breeding season, right? We count the number of birds rafting on the water during the early season. That gives us a minimum population size, because that's going to be roughly representative of each pair. Each single bird on the water is representative of each pair. And the other survey we do is a post-season AOB survey, apparently occupied burrow survey. This identifies the burrows that we think there used to be puffins in. There's some obvious concerns about that. Because the puffins aren't even there anymore, how accurate are these signs really? Is it really worth doing? Let's find out. So this year we've gone about validating this survey. So I'm going to show you how we do this. Firstly, we know which boroughs are occupied from the puffin cam, these yellow arrows, and we can compare these to the boroughs which the survey picked out as occupied. You can see here that roughly 7 boroughs were actually occupied, and then it got 2 that it thought were occupied and weren't, and 2 that actually were occupied and the survey didn't pick up. So what do? Well, we put that into a matrix with true positives, true negatives, false positives and false negatives. And we map that on here. But it's not that useful just looking at numbers, is it, on a screen? It doesn't really tell us that much. So we use a few different statistics. And these are recall, which is the ability of the borough survey to identify all of the active boroughs on the island. The ability of the borough survey to only identify active boroughs, that's precision. So in other words, if you had 100 boroughs that are identified as active, how many of them would actually be active? And then you have the mean between the two, which is the F1 score. And this is what we end up with, roughly around 0.8 for all of them. Might not sound that good, you know, we'd love to have 0.95, we'd love to have 95% confidence, but a 20% error in a survey when we're going on after the birds have left, looking at the entrance of a borough for signs of occupation, I think I'm pretty happy with a 20% error. So it's not too bad. Now we can map this onto the population data. So it gives us a bit of context for these figures. But there is one problem. We can't really put it onto the AOB data from previous years. And that's because things like observer effects might affect it, also the way different vegetation grows through the year. But it does still give us context. Now, what does this data actually tell us? So you have here the red line, which is the AOB survey, and the blue line, which is the RAF cam. We can see that they've recovered well from the 2014 seabird rep. You can see that real dip there around 2014. It also looks like there's potentially a bit of an increase since 2005. In fact, the numbers this year for the boroughs look particularly good. Although, of course, we don't have the context of that error for previous years. But there is some more concerning news on the productivity front. So productivity, on the hand, doesn't look that great. Puffins in general have a productivity across the UK of around 0.6, but Alderney in the last couple of years has seen that decrease and drop off. So you can see that this year it's actually around 0.35. Now, what I would note is the error there is really big. That's largely because not all the data has completely been analysed for this year's survey. And we do hope that once all of the data has been analysed, essentially once we've forced our ecologists to go through huge numbers of videos, the error will be slightly smaller and the productivity will be slightly higher. But nevertheless, it is concerning. Okay, we're going to move on from puffins now and look at one of the other seabirds that we have on Alderney, one of the really iconic ones, and that is the northern gannet. So for those of you that have never been to Alderney, this is the west coast of the island, and we can see here Les Attack, one of the 2 gannet colonies that we have on the island. So there's Les Attack, and then further out to sea is Ortac. Now, the gannets unfortunately do suffer from quite low productivity in Alderney. That's probably because they're quite far south in the breeding range, so they're foraging much further than other gannets in colonies across the UK. And furthermore, they were hit by highly pathogenic avian influenza in 2002. I'm sure many of you here will remember that. So what do? Well, there's lots of monitoring that goes on under the Ramsar programme, for example, productivity. There's also survival through ringing work done by the Alderney Bird Observatory and the Channel Islands Bird Ringing Scheme. There's entanglement data and plastic data taken. But today we're going to focus on the census. So the gannet census. Well, these are the results. So a census was undertaken in 2021. In 2022, you had avian flu. And then in 2023, another census was undertaken. And you can see that in just 1 year, there's been a 29% overall decline in the population and actually a 46% decline in Ortac. These are really shocking numbers for us. If you put it into context, that's essentially reset the colonies to around the 1980s. Furthermore, it's essentially like removing Ortac. You've just wiped Ortac off the map. I'd also like to point out that even before avian flu, the populations had plateaued. They weren't growing anymore. Now, this might just be because they'd reached capacity, but it could also be because of things like low food availability. So it's more important than ever to really understand these colonies. And that takes us on to the next bit of the presentation, which is a little bit more positive, hopefully. And that is monitoring seabirds with drones. So we were really lucky in Alderney to have a seabird watch team from Oxford Brookes come over, and they provided training to some of the Wildlife Trust ecologists as to how to operate drones around wildlife. They provided guidance as to how to do this safely and how to collect valuable data. And importantly, in the short term, they also did undergo some data collection. They came out there and we flew 2 censuses, one of Ortac, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner now, and one of Lesitac, which was the colony we could see in the video earlier. So why drones? Well, they're cost effective and they have real low carbon. Compare it to a plane. You know, we used to, well, we still do fly planes to survey these colonies. They're pretty blooming expensive. Although I must say, Jersey Skydiving do a very nice and generous job for us on Alderney. So thank you to them. But I think the real benefit of drones is their versatility, their replicability, and the high quality of the photos. You can go out there and you can fly these surveys every week, and you can fly the exact same survey. Now, this colony out here is Ortac. Ortac's always been a bit of a problem for us because we'd have to sail out there, it costs loads, and then we're trying to take photos of the colonies to do things like productivity observations. But now we can sit on the cliffs, we can fly a drone out to Ortac, we can take HD video or photos every week, we can map the same nests, and we can get fantastic productivity and demographic data at very little cost. So the images are really good quality. They can be easily repeated if overexposed, which is a real benefit for us. And of course, you take hundreds of them, and you can do that in real time, which is brilliant. And then this is when the real magic happens. You can map it on 3D. Now, this image looks slightly blurry, but I'm just showing you this one to give you a context for the topography. But the computer's just struggling to render it at this distance. But this shows you Lesitac mapped on 3D from the drone survey that was conducted. And if we then move on to the next video, you can see here what the actual quality of that is like if you zoom in. It's fantastic. And this has huge applications for us. Previously, there's been real limits with trying to census these gannets from still images and from not mapping them. You know, you've got limits like them being obscured by ledges, etc. Okay, and we do also have another benefit coming out from working with these drones. And so one of the things Seabird Watch is really famous for is they use AI to count things like penguins in the Antarctic. And we thought, well, let's give it a go with the gannets. And it worked. It works really, really well. It was a little bit heartbreaking for me because I've spent tens of hours counting these things. And to see this do it in about 20 seconds was a bit upsetting. But you can see the applications. You know, you could go out there and every colony in the UK could be surveyed with the same drones, with the same methodology. And then in the same week, you could feed it all through the AI and get a count like that. There's huge applications for it. There's also been an offer that I'd like to extend to the room from Seabird Watch for training like they gave us in 2025. If you're interested, please come and talk to me afterwards. I can pass contact details on. So you've caught the fish, you've caught the data. What do you do now? Well, you can use it to advise conservation action. For example, we know that the gannets are affected by plastic entanglements. Around 0.7% of pairs may have lost a gannet in 2023. But it's important to remember, time and resources are not infinite. So when do you take action? And that's really, I think, what a lot of the talks that are going to follow on from me are talking about. So it's about collaboration. It's about working with other organizations, which has been a real theme so far today. It's about data sharing. And that's not just with the people in this room today. It's also with developers. It's with the decision-making bodies to make sure that they're aware of what we've got here. And it's about strategy. Now, the Ramsar 5-year strategy is coming up for review, but really we need broad strategies to tell us when to take action based on this data that we have. Okay, so I'll move on now and just do some acknowledgements. I'd like to just mostly thank, obviously we've got a huge number of people who've helped submit data for this talk today. Francis giving me the finger. Not that one. But I'd like to really just point towards the activity organisations who are the ones who do all the work on the Ramsar site. So most of the work today has been conducted by the Wildlife Trust, but there is also a huge amount of data collected by the other organisations, and that is the Alderney Bird Observatory, the Channel Islands Bird Breeding Scheme, and the Alderney Animal Welfare Society. So I really just wanted to highlight that. So yeah, thank you for listening. I'd just like to finally say I'd like to dedicate this presentation to Professor Charles Michel, who sat in the Alderney Ramsar Advisory Group and he was crucial to the development of Alderney's Atlantic puffin monitoring programme and the Ramsar site as it is today. So yeah, thank you for listening.